Good morning. Welcome back. Right. Hope you all had a good break. So, today, what we would like to do is look at primarily three senior important poskim from the camp, I think we call them on the right. Not right as opposed to wrong, of course, but on the right wing. So we have the so-called modern Orthodox, and I'm not sure that Lubavitcher Rebbe would be happy if I included him in that, so forgive me. I mean the more permissive stance, let's call it that, okay? On the left, so to speak, we have the more permissive stance, which extends to giving shiurei Torah, including Gemara, to women. We have the so-called centrist. Again, these are my terms, they are subjective, but I call it centrist for want of a better term because it is in the middle, and that is what we'd call the yeshivisha stance, Beis Yaakov, Chafetz Chaim. And now, today, we are going to learn three important gedolim they weren't just, two of them certainly were Hasidic Rebbes, but they were also gedolim b'Torah, acknowledged by all of their peers as being eminent gedolim b'Torah and in Psak, in Halacha. And I'm going to do it a little bit in reverse order. We're going to look at Reb Vosner, Shevet HaLevi, right? Reb Vosner Zatzal. We will look at a tshuva from the Kloisenberger Rebbe, Zatzal, Divrei Yatziv, and we will look at the Satmar Rebbe. We'll look at a psak from Divrei Yoel from the Satmar Rebbe. Those three with them are chorus, okay? So this is the other opinion that we are presenting this morning, okay? So turn to page 8. And this is a tshuva from Reb Vosner, Shevet HaLevi, Chelik Beis, Chelik Vav, Simon, Kuf Gimel. Shalom Aleichem. You have a good time?
Yes.
Awesome. Nice to have you back. Baruch Hashem. Thanks for bringing great weather with you. Okay. We're doing page 8. Shevet, a tshuva from Reb Vosner. Be'inyan, and we're going to skip some bits, okay? So follow properly with me. Be'inyan geder limud Torah l'noshim. Says Reb Vosner. Afal pishat varim uvorim berambam ubeshulchan aruch yeridei simen reish mem vav mikol mokem le'em emna atzmi milahabia dati ho'aniyo lemaisa. However, even though there is, as we know, there is Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, nonetheless, I will not desist from giving you my opinion. As sometimes I like to say, when you are entitled to my opinion. Right. Hinei, L'sheina Rambam v'atzuva Shulchan Aruch, we can leave out that paragraph, we know. Next paragraph. Hageder ha'mavuar mizeh, da'af al gav de mitzvahs shaloi lilmoid, de mitzvahs shaloi lilmoid, mikol makim imlomdu, kvag makablis k'tzas schar. So we see clearly that even though mitzvahs that they don't need to perform, yet were women to learn them, if they do learn them, they of course get schar. Ve'ein mokim loimar kasher rotzalei me'echel migdolei adoyros deike isur asay. And there's no place to say, like one of the gedolim did say, that there is an isur asay from the pasuk of Elimadu Temes Benechem V'lo Bnei Seichem Deze'enoi Doha Makablim Schar Ke'ena Mitzvah V'Oisa. They get schar as if they are Eina Mitzvah V'Oisa. So it can't be Osa to teach them the things that they need to know. V'hu Mishas Soita V'hu Inyan Bruria Eshet Rav Meir. And I would like to do a session, not sure, at some point I want to do maybe 2 on which I hope you'll find fascinating. I've done some research on it. Women throughout the ages, starting right back from Michal, all the way down to Rashi's daughters and other learned women through the generations who did impact the Torah world in an interesting way. And we'll do some stuff on that because I think it's really, really interesting. And Beruria, Rabbi Meir's wife, is a fascinating case in point, but we're not going to do that today. Okay. Okay, here he brings one. The next underlined bit. In the Hakdama to the famous, the Tshuvas of Chavos Yair, Shekosav, Sheziknosoi, She'al Shmon Nikro Sifrei. One of the famous Achronim, the Gedolei Achronim, is called the Chavos Yair, Rabbi Yair Bachrach. right? Very important sefer from the Chuvas Achronim, right? Why did I call my sefer Chavois Yair? He said on the name of his grandmother, who was called Chava. She was Yechida B'mina B'Torah. She was unique in Torah. V'hoyu G'dolei Hadoir Shoyalim Mimena B'divrei Torah. And the G'dolei Hadoir would ask her opinion in Torah. So, on the one hand, it's kind of the exception that proves the rule. But it shows, incidentally, that it's not, and this is really also quite important, this is not Chas v'Shalom in any way an anti-woman campaign to keep women out of positions of power or leadership, and that's going to be another whole topic. We need to actually move on. Once we finish this subtopic, we're going to move on to the next one, which is also very important. Al Koponim, you see, the Gedolei Hador had no problem asking her, because they recognized that she was unique and she had that wisdom. And indeed, the Sefer Chavois Yair, the famous Chuvas, is named after her, after his grandmother, who was a Talmidah Chachama. Right. However, he then goes on in the next paragraph to say that it's the exception rather than the rule. I'm just trying to get to the... Okay, go to Veda, the next paragraph, Veda. Yes? Veda. The Dava Poshetu de Lav Davka Ha'av Lebitoy Ebeis HaSefer Osa Lilmed Lenoshim Teresh Ba'al Peh Elogam Ha'isha La'atzma Ba'ifon Proti Asura Shetivtach Ba'atzma Shehi Mehamiut She'enom Begidra Geder Melamdem Tiflus. Now here he says something which is interesting. He says the Isur to teach a woman Teresh Ba'al Peh, based on the Meiri, which he brings, which we've discussed previously, which is the danger because many women may not be able to handle the approach to learning that intensive Torah Sheba'al Peh requires, and therefore it poses a potential threat or danger to the integrity of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. On the other hand, the issue is to teach. What about the women themselves? So we've already seen a number of Makairos that says that it's mutter for a woman herself. He says something really interesting, and it's hard to argue with it. What does he say? He said, if the problem is that we are concerned that the consequence, the outcome will be, at some level, a perversion or a distortion of Torah Sheba'al Peh, then surely it should make no difference whether it's looked at from the perspective of the one who's teaching it or the one who's learning it. If it's the outcome, so how does a woman, this is his point. Of course, he totally accepts, having quoted the grandmother of the Chavos Yair, that there are women, the exception rather than the rule, who are perfectly able to handle the depth and intensity of the academic discipline, which is Torah Sheba'al Peh. But who decides? Who decides which category you fall into? Do we just leave it to every individual woman or girl to decide that? He says, with, I think quite logically, that no, you can't just because you want to learn Gemara. There's lots of things I want to do. I'd love to be a Kohen. I wouldn't, but I don't know. Whatever. But the point is, it's not just about granting access on the basis of you want it. If the problem is that a potential outcome which is negative for Torah, then just your subjective desire to learn Torah should not trump the possible negative outcome. Remember, the Roiv, Chazal decided that for the Roiv of women, this is Torah Sheba'al Peh is not for them. That is the psak. So what are we going to say? So there are exceptions? Indeed, there are exceptions. But who should be koveya? Logically, who should decide? Surely not the person themselves that is highly subjective. That makes sense. I think what he's saying makes perfect sense. How do we decide? Is a woman allowed to say to herself, well, I am batuach and confident that I am of this miyut? Maybe you're deluding yourself. How are we going to know? So he just says quite definitively that surely, he does not enlighten us as to the mechanism by which we would decide whether any given woman falls into the majority or the minority. He doesn't say that. But he does say, and I think it's eminently logical, that that especially given that as the woman is certainly is subjective, shouldn't be the one to decide. That's the point over here in this paragraph. V'das HaRambam, he then brings the Das HaRambam. Okay, we've done the Das HaRambam already. Okay, just a second. Let's go right on the next page. Umizeh da'adayin. Yes, you see the paragraph umizeh. Da'adayin ein lonu heter lilmidim abonis tnachim amaforshim ho'amukim k'may haRamban ve'Ibn Ezra u'Kedema. He says to then approach Torah shebichsav from a Torah Sheba'al Peh perspective. In other words, to learn it in depth analysis. I mean, anybody, I don't know what exposure you have had to learning Ramban ala Torah, but that's a good start. Don't wait for the movie. Yeah, Andrew Lloyd Webber, the musical, the Ramban, the musical. I don't think it's coming to a theatre anytime soon, near you or not near you. But the Ramban ala Torah is a seminal, a classic limud. It's tough. It's not easy at all. I mean, it's incredibly important. It's fundamental, but it contains so many yesodus. But it's not by any means an easy limud, and therefore to teach Chumash with Ibn Ezra and Ramban, just because the subject matter is Torah Shebechsav, but the approach and the whole methodology and the approach is very Torah Sheba'al Peh. So he says that for that there'd be no heter. And he says even Rashi, the Gamul Pirush Rashi ala Torah halei molei v'godush droshes chazal Torah Sheba'al Peh. V'yodati, drop a few lines next to the hand there. V'yodati sheroiv botei sefer lebonos b'doireinu ein oimdim bezeh umafrizim al hamidah v'neged hahalocha. Now, Rav Vosner, let's not forget, Rav Vosner is certainly considered one of the preeminent poskim of this generation, right? Didn't die that long ago. Shevet HaLevi. And he says, I know well that most of the Botei Sefer, he's referring to the Beis Yaakov movement, no doubt, as you'll see in a minute, they push the boundaries. And in his view, too far. That's his view. Ukvar omarti pa'am lemechanech hadogol haraboni tzadik b'masav Reb Avrom Yosef Wolf Zatzal. Rav Wolf was the one who was very much associated. I think to this day, I think the Beis Yaakov, if I'm not mistaken, the big one in Bnei Brak is still called Wolfs. The Semen still called Wolfs to this day on Al Shmoy. He says the Shevet HaLevi, I spoke to him and I told him, Ki HaTorah hi nitzchis. The Torah is eternal. Ve'im omru ki melamdom tiflis. And if Chazal said that to teach them is melamdom tiflis, keinu b'chol hadoros, then that remains so eternally. And even if we, because of a exigent circumstances, emergency situation, there's Eis Lasses Lashem, because otherwise the women would Lulei Zeho Yabonis Eiskis Begaro Mimenu, Mikoma came a man Mephis, Miomad Beminion Al Zev Dova Poshet, who decided exactly where we're dealing, there is no question, I think, pretty much whichever section of Klal Yisrael you belong to, there is a Seif and Shulchan Aruch, there's a Gemara, there's a Seif and Shulchan Aruch, and there's a Rambam. So the question is, okay, we have the Chofetz Chaim, we have Eis Lasses Lashem Efeiru Terosecha, and there is a need. But that doesn't mean that like we've said so many times, that this is really important, that Seif and Shulchan Aruch does not get erased. It now becomes a question of boundaries. So what is necessary to prevent this disaster if our daughters are not going to learn Torah? And who decides the exact boundaries? And by the way, if we go back, and we're going to do it a little bit later today, hopefully, because the Kloisenberger will quote the Chofetz Chaim. There's an interesting one. Yes? Because if you know, politically, they were sort of obviously very different ends of the spectrum. But he quotes him, and he does something really interesting. And we should do this ourselves and go back and look at the Chofetz Chaim, because he is the Moreh D'Shmaitze. He is the one who took upon himself, on his shoulders, as the Posek Hador, to say that it's Eis Lasses Lashem, and therefore things are mutter. Well, if we look carefully in what he says is mutter, there's a certain vagueness. We're going to see this, but to extend it, who decided? And this is what he's saying. And he says, even, next paragraph, וגם מה שכוספתי למעלה, דפשוטן של דברים מותר ללמדון, גם מבפנים הספר אינו ברור כל כך. He said, even that which I wrote above, that for women, you can teach them internally from the text, he says, even that, I'm not so sure myself. He's questioning himself. He says, the point is, we need to, let's be very clear, we need to sell the women on the centrality, the depth, the importance, the brilliance, etc., of Torah as a value system, as kihem chayenu, and if that can be achieved orally or orally, then who says that it needs to be so close to and mimic the quote unquote authentic learning experience, which is textual? By the way, in parentheses, you know, as an educator, if you know anything, if you ever go into education, you will know. I can tell you the way it's called in England. That if you are involved in SEN or special educational needs, or you are trying to get through to a student, and this is something you really should know something about in terms of yourself. There are primarily 4 methods through which people learn and absorb well. You do a learning style analysis. I'm not a professional. I don't have the tools. But if you go to an ed psych, you know, an educational psychologist, and with a child, they will analyze, you know, when you're looking for whether it's ADHD or dyslexia or dyspraxia or Asperger's or any of these other things that impair the learning process. And you should know yourself. Are you a person that learns visually, orally, AUR, orally, tactile, sensory? There are different ways that people primarily absorb, kinetically, that people absorb. If the point here is that they should absorb, maybe that means they should listen to Shiurei Torah. Maybe. It depends on, and even he says, remember, and he's got an interesting point up his sleeve. He has an ace up his sleeve. He says, the Taz, who says, Anoshim boyos lishmoya. And I can tell you, by the way, I do have 20 plus years experience of teaching girls and women in a range of settings, across a range of schools, and having given women's shiurim I've been engaged across the spectrum, certainly in the UK, from the left to the right, and it is the exception rather than the rule that women really want to or engage and learn properly, ideally through the text. They're very happy to listen. They're more happy to listen than... This is, I know it's a generalization, but that's what generalizations are. And it does jive with my experience. Chazal say, by Hakel, Noshim, they came Lishmaya. So, who says, so he's actually questioning himself, he says, who says therefore it now all of a sudden becomes mutter to mimic and copy the entire learning experience, which is very textual? Miyamar, he's even questioning himself. Okay, so therefore let's go on, let's try, because I'm spending too long on this, but let's go as follows. Next paragraph where you've got the little hand there. Kivan shenohagu go'inei tzadikei hadoiros b'botei sefer lebonos lefi matzav hadoiros v'rotik and godel bozeh. Since, and he's referring here clearly to the Chafetz Chaim, shuv kosher lamoid al zeh sheloi lilmoid. Therefore, I can't really turn around and say they shouldn't be learning. Gami b'fnim asforim dvarim shemuta lilmoid, especially things which they are allowed to learn. I can't stop that. Dahainu aleph, and here he clarifies pshutei hamikra, a simple explanation of the pasuk. Notice he says, "Avaloi amkus hamikrim kol pirush Rashi v'Rambanu kitzu b'zeh," but not all the depth of the Rashi and the Ramban. Very interesting. And base Torah shabal peh kemishnayos u'gemara isur gomor kemalamdon tiflois. Now, so there is his perspective. He's going along with the Chafetz Chaim, but he's quite severely limiting it. He is very reluctantly allowing them to learn inside, but certainly not learning the amkus, the depth of Chumash with all of the Rashis and the Rambans, certainly not Mishnayos or Gemara, very clear. Now they need to know their halachas, etc. Okay, that's Rav Wosner. Interesting, hey? Now let's move on to the Kloisenberger. The Kloisenberger, page 9. It's taking slightly longer than I thought. By the way, I should add, because in case you're not familiar with Rabbi Kusil Yehuda Halberstam, Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Livracha, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who was related to the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel, even though they did not get along. They shared, pretty much the only thing they shared was their opposition to Zionism, their vehement opposition to Zionism. But they also did not get on a number of different levels. But the Kloisenberger Rebbe was the one who very famously went through the camps, looking after Jewish boys and girls, survived after having had his family slaughtered. He was a masmid otzum. He would learn sometimes 20 hours at a stretch. He was a boki b'shas u'poskim. He never stopped learning. He was acknowledged as a goin, a godel in Torah, benigla, benista. Just to give you some idea, he was a Chassidish Rebbe for, I don't know how many years, 60, 70 years. Every night Hanukkah, he would give a different answer to the famous question of the Beis Yosef, why there's only 7 nights, why there's 8 nights and not 7 nights, because the first night wasn't a miracle. He'd give a different answer using Nigla and Nista and Lomdus every night of Hanukkah for I don't know how many years, 60, 70 years, and they're all published. He was a goyin otzum. He then went on and set up Kiryat Sanz Laniado Hospital, which is run al Pi Torah. And he did an incredible amount, so he is not by any means to be taken lightly. And the posek, a world-class posek, and here is a tshuva from him. Let's first of all note the date. This is Divrei Yatziv, Yeridea, Simon Kuf Lamed Tes. The date on the place, it's written in Kiryat Sanz in 1967, Tovshin Chov Zayin. Okay? Just gives us some context. And let's run through this. So he says, he first brings the Shulchan Aruch, etc., and of course, that goes without saying. Then he brings, you can leave out the second paragraph because that actually takes us into some interesting territory. Ein Lozos, go to Zion. Hadrin al-Amr, Ein Lozos mipsak habar b'shulchan aruch. Shaloi lelamdam rak kadei sheyedu samaisa. They need to know what they need to know. Now, next paragraph. V'yodua. Shekamo gedolim miYisrael midoros shelafanenu chibru sfarim yuchadim lenoshim. It is well known that many gedolim from the previous generations specifically wrote sfarim for women. Kamoi Mahari Abuhav, the Mahari Abuhav, who wrote the Tzenorena, the Menorah Samoer, which was translated into Ivritaych, and then the Bal Yismach Moshe Chiba Hilchas Nida beIvritaych lenoshim, and the Mittler Rebbe Rav Emtzoi Milubavitch Chiber Pekeach Ibrim. V'loi olo al datam lases botei sefer labonis l'torish b'chsav torish balpeh u'lalamdom sifrei chazal kinesinosam. In other words, they were concerned. These were gedolim who were concerned about that our wives and daughters should have the knowledge necessary to live as from Yidden, but it didn't enter their mind yet to set up a school network. Then next paragraph. Uma ma'oid ra olai hamase shenifratz hadovar ka'es. And therefore, I see this as a very negative thing, that there has been a breach of all boundaries. Ad kedei kach shemelamdim sifrei chakira lenoshim shedaton kalos. That they are teaching philosophy to women. Shekiyodua hoyegdolei yisrael misnagdim l'chol toik v'lelimud zeh gam letalmidei chachamim v'loimdim. And the truth is, even men and Talmidei Chachamim should be approaching subjects such as philosophy with great caution, if at all. And he quotes the Yaiverts, the Chassid Yaiverts, and this is just as a very quick sidebar, the Chassid Yaiverts who lived through the expulsion in 1492 of Spain and attributed the loss of an entire doir to their engagement with philosophy, and they were not able to withstand the. You say it was the golden age of Spain, but we lost an entire doyer, and the Chassid Yaivetz who lived through it very famously attributes it to our flirtation with philosophy, and it claimed the spiritual lives of a whole doyer. This is what he says. And then he says over the page, let's go on. Go to the top of the page. Go to the top of the left column, top line. Umeid ani olai shomayim va'oretz. This is the Kloisenberger Rebbe speaking. He says, I bring heaven and earth to testify. Sheba'u lefonai kamo besuloi salomdos bebotei sefer charedim lema'oid. Many girls who learn in very frum Haredi schools have come to me. Ubochu lefonai b'mar nafshom, and they have cried to me bitterly. Litten lehem eitzos, to give them advice. Yan nisoiru lehem rachmana litzlan, sfeikos v'deos zoros be'emunas Hashem yizborach v'toirosai rachmana litzlan. As a result of exposure to more sophisticated systems of thought in the Haredi schools, they are questioning their own emunah in Hashem and in the Torah. And they've cried to me. Al yidei shalomdu imohem mideis aristo kadoima lazeh, because they've been learning ideas, Aristotle and others. Ve'einon yicholes lizgaber al divrei akfira shenitu b'liboisam. And they're not able to overcome the doubts. It's all very well you want to teach a shiur on emunah, belief in God, and you throw out some questions, and what happens if the kid only likes the questions and doesn't like your answers? Your answers are not good enough. And what have you left them with? You've left them with big doubts. So, and I don't want to comment on this now. Remind me towards the end of this, certainly of the series, I will comment on it, because I was involved when I was in England in actually quite a wonderful organization called Klal Chazon, where I did get involved in some of this style of thing, and I need to answer myself for that, and I will do. But he is saying that, in his opinion, the opening up. I can tell you a story. You know what? Let me tell you a story. Okay, let's wait. Let's wait. I'll wait till I finish this tshuva, and then I'll tell you a story. Okay? So, he says, furthermore, I've heard, next paragraph, I've heard they're also teaching girls sometimes Kabbalah Sfarim. Oy vey, abroch, as we say. Bad news. Okay, how on earth could they do this? Ube'emes, next paragraph. Ube'emes hoyitzrichem talmidei chachamim muvhakim v'yirei Hashem marabim lechaber svarim yicholos l'bonis. The truth is, really, there should be a curriculum that should be devised by experts in what the word they love here, pedagogy, and those who know Torah, Yirei Shamayim, to design a curriculum that is appropriate for them. And therefore, go to the last paragraph, he says it's difficult, but what can I say? He says, this is the way to save the generation. Don't bring a proof from holy women who taught themselves and learnt and taught themselves. Because they knew. Here, interesting, he's saying, kind of not like Rav Vosner, he's saying they knew that they were able to withstand it. Chas v'shalom, to move away from what is psak, and that's his last line, chas v'shalom, to move away from the psak of Shulchan Aruch and Shas. Now this is, if I may say so, a very unsatisfying tshuva, because if you read it and translate it, you come out with basically nothing has changed. Everything remains in place. He then writes another tshuva, and the date is 1 week later. Kiret Sanz, look at the first one is Tetzaveh, Tovshin Chav Zayin. The next one is Gimel Vayakel, Tovshin Chav Zayin. So this is a further, it's a week later. And to me, I found this really interesting. And now he begins to open up a little bit more. Let's have a look quickly. He says, I'll leave out the first paragraph because it's a red herring for our purposes. Turn over the page and go to base. And here is a really interesting biographical detail, which I found fascinating. I don't know whether you will. He says, now what must have happened is, this is my conjecture, what must have happened is that whoever he wrote this tshuva to came back at him within a week with questions, with a request for further clarification, and no doubt must have thrown at him the psak of the Chofetz Chaim. And said, but it's all very well, Kloisenberger Rebbe, I understand what you're saying, But the closing bit, so you've said no. But the Chofetz Chaim said yes. So now he responds that, you can work out that's what must have happened. And now he responds in Oispace. Uma shekosav mehagon had mehatzadik hakoyin hagodel meechov ba'ala Chofetz Chaim zechuse yugun alayni. You have to say it in that Havara. That's how they say it. Yeah. Zechuse yugun alayni. Onoichi hikartiv koidem sheyoda mimenu malas koid teirasai. I knew him before you did. V'yodati goidel erkoi uma'alosai, and I know. In other words, I am not arguing on the Chofetz Chaim. I absolutely accept and recognize him as a preeminent Godel and Tzaddik Hador. V'yodati goidel erkoi uma'alosai, and I absolutely know his value, his stature. Ve'ein ha'Chofetz Chaim zokuk la'apotropos al gedulosoi u'kedushosoi. The Chofetz Chaim does not need anybody to be made on his greatness and his holiness. Umi lo yecherad ligoinusoi u'psokov. Who will not tremble at his genius and at his psokim? Beautiful lashon. Beautiful lashon. Ach Torah ve'emes ksiv ba. But at the same time, this is Torah, and I'm entitled to say my opinion. Torah has to be emes. Emes nitla kol loima datoi be'emes v'das. V'das Rabbinerseminar v'Aveiseinu hakdoshim sheloi rotzu lozu stia krala mimasha muskim la'alocha b'shulchan aruch b'hanal le'isur. Yes, I utterly and totally respect the stature and the greatness and the ability of the Chofetz Chaim to issue this psak, but that was his view, and Das Rabbinerseminar and Aveiseinu was not. I go to the next paragraph. And if you're going to tell me, oh, the generations have changed, then the minute you say that, you've opened the door. And let me tell you, you will have this thrown at your face. Whether it comes to partnership minyanim, another topic we're going to have a lot of fun with, women rabbis, etc. And lots of other things, yeah? And then the Chofetz Chaim did something, and the Chofetz Chaim clearly knew what he was doing, and he had the ability to do so. I don't think he would necessarily like everybody who quotes him. You understand? And he points out there is a danger. Talmid will come along who have not fully understood the gravity of the situation. They'll say, no, look, Chofetz Chaim, you see, Shulchan Aruch is not an absolute. I'll prove it to you. All you need is a great rabbi. And let me throw something at you. Please forgive me for saying this. Afro lepumayu, it is apikorosus. And I say now, it is apikorosus, what I'm about to say. And it was, I think the phrase was first coined by Blue Greenberg. Doesn't matter. Okay. It's just a name of an apicorus you should know. And it goes as follows. Where there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way. Unquote. You hear that? Shabbos belts. An Eruv. Come on. It's all a joke. Where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way. If there is a rabbinic will to make it happen, agunais. All of the problems that we have today, the rabbis are insensitive. And if they really wanted, they would do something about it. And the proof is, where they decided they needed to, they found all sorts of wonderful, creative, halachic solutions. A Shabbos belt. Try explaining that the first time to somebody. Yeah, right. An Eruv, you've got a piece of fish wire up at the top of a pole. Nobody can see. Oh, and all of a sudden I can carry. Yeah? If they really wanted to, they would find a way. They have enough authority and power and creativity. And where there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way. This canard, look that up. This calumny, look that up. This perversion was coined, I think, by Blue Greenberg. And it is something you will be faced with in some form or another. Yoatzot, Maharat, I don't know if you know any of these terms, yeah? A rabbah, a woman rabbi, partnership minyanim, all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. But we can't just dismiss it with the response has to be a clear one, a rational one. But we need to know. You actually need to know. I'm just throwing that out. Not for today. We will be moving on to this, okay? So he makes that point. Fine. And therefore he says, as the Mishnah says. And you do need to be always, one does need to be careful. One of the most important lessons in rabbinics is patience. I think we've mentioned this already. Have a masunim badin. Because it's the law, what I sometimes call the law of thoughtless precedents. You set a precedent, but Rabbi Robert said, this is okay. And it was okay for him, it's not okay for me. You always have to think when you're taking a public policy or a decision that is going to be enacted in public, you have to think about where this is potentially going to lead. And sometimes you have to say no to something, even though in that particular case it's right, because of where it can and will lead. And you need to always have that in mind. Just wanted to say that. That's important. For today, we're just going to finish this off. We're not even going to manage to do Rabbi Yoel. And tomorrow, remind me the story. I'll start with it. It's the story of... it's gone out of my head now. Oi, what was the context? Give me a second. The story was with Rav Zimmerman. It'll come back to me. Okay. I remember I owe you a story. Okay. So, now, the Chofetz Chaim... Says the Kloisenberger, but I brought the Chofetz Chaim. V'gam Chofetz Chaim shevi kvei teirosai v'hu b'likutei halacha zal say tishom kfi sheyanti yishom b'dvarav nira shahaheora shaloi koi al Torah shebechsav daika. I don't agree with the Chofetz Chaim, he said. But even if you want to quote the Chofetz Chaim, look inside. What does he say? Chofetz Chaim was clearly talking about Torah shebechsav lelamdo lechatchila, as he says over there. He mentions the Menorah Samoir. And he says, Musarei Chazal mimeseches avos gam kein loy bier be'eza oifen. He doesn't clarify any further. He just doesn't say how you teach these Pirkei Avos. Do you teach it inside? Do you teach it externally? How do you teach it? To what depth? It could be you just create some sort of likut and you teach it to them outside. He says, so even quoting the Chofetz Chaim at me, he said, it's not going to help you very much. Aval stam al Torah shebal peh loy diber haChofetz Chaim klal. The Chofetz Chaim did not comment at all on teaching Torah shebal peh to women. Ulechinom kosav kvei teirosai b'leshonai. So he's firing back at the fellow who asked him this and said, "You said to me, the Kloisenberger, that." You don't understand. It's in wonderment, lepella, that I ignored the opinions of two Gedolim. I'm not sure who the other one was, but he says no, it's not true. He says because look in the Likutei Halachos and you'll see. He doesn't say what you're saying that he says. But anyway, he says no way. They should not be learning philosophy or Sifrei Kabbalah. And also you have another problem. He says you often get men teaching them, and that's another problem. And therefore, no. The end. And that is, so we've seen the Rav Vosner and we've seen the Kloisenberger. Tomorrow we'll have a look at Rabbi Yoel, we'll look at the Satmar Rebbe, and we'll move on to some more anecdotal stuff about the Steipler and the Chazon Ish and his sister, and the story, and then we'll move on to another topic. Shkaya.